EPA has been quite busy for the last couple of weeks. In just the last month or so, your agency has proposed requiring most new cars to be solely electric. You've tightened pollution standards for heavy vehicles and imposed new limits on mercury releases from coal-fired plants. And I hear you're close to releasing new greenhouse gas emission standards for power plants. Assuming all these proposals are enacted and enforced, what impact will they have on climate change and on public health?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. And it's great to follow my former colleague, Melissa. And wonderful that she's here in Massachusetts. Wonderful for me to be back here in Massachusetts. I'll just take one moment to share with you that I got started on my environmental career right here in Massachusetts. At the Attorney General's office, which I think has graduated a number of us that are working in this field. And I had no idea that's what I wanted to do until I lucked into that job. So for students in here, you just never know which way your life may take you. I've got a couple of stories like that in my past. So this is an incredible time at EPA. I was at the EPA during the Obama administration, and I thought it was an incredible time then. And it was an incredible time then, but it is more incredible now. And I think that that is partly due to the administration that we have in place, the Biden-Harris administration. It is partly, and I think, in fact, significantly due to things that Melissa was talking about, which is just, if we thought we could not talk about this 6, 7, 8 years ago, we can't not talk about it anymore, right? More and more people from more and more parts of our economy, parts of our society are saying, we have just got to do something about this. So you have a lot of people that are pushing. So, of course, it is not just the EPA that is working on the president's climate agenda. It is every single agency across the federal government. And just as Melissa was saying, here in Massachusetts, you have a cabinet level position that oversees it. And a lot of what she's doing is working with other agencies. It's not her little office that's going to do all of this. It's all the other offices that are going to do all of this. So it's EPA, it's the Department of Energy, it's the Department of Transportation, it's the Department of the Interior, and it's agencies that you might not immediately spring to mind. Housing and Urban Development, right? Which is a huge, housing is a huge part of both the challenge and the solution here. So there's a lot going on. But you asked me about the EPA rules, so I am going to answer that. You mentioned a couple. My old office, the Office of Air and Radiation, has been working on amazing transportation rules. Not only did we put out the truck rule that you mentioned in December, which will massively reduce traditional air pollutants from heavy-duty trucks, and along the way reduce a lot of climate pollution. We have a proposal out now for significant, the toughest ever climate rules for cars and trucks. Invite everybody's comment on them. They are ambitious, but we believe realistic, and will continue the transformation and accelerate the transformation to a zero carbon electric system. I believe those rules, I'm not very good with statistics, so I try not to rattle them off because I'll get them wrong. But the reductions from that rule are the equivalent of 2 entire years worth of carbon CO2 emissions from the country. So that's massively impactful. We are about very shortly to put out a proposal around fossil fire power plants. This comes on top of the mercury rule that you mentioned, the good neighbor rule, which is also a significant power sector and now industrial sector rule that addresses pollution that crosses state boundaries, something of huge importance to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, being at the end of the tailpipe for at least for the eastern part of the country, as well as other things that are happening in the power sector. We also have oil and gas regulations. Methane, a more aggressive climate pollutant even than carbon, is substantially emitted through oil and natural gas development and use, all the way from getting it out of the ground to putting it into your stove and your furnace. And we have the most aggressive rules ever out for public comment. The comment period closed actually on those that we will be finalizing, which will take another huge bite out of it. When you put these kinds of rules together with the appliance standards that the Department of Energy is doing, with transportation rules, with rules from and decisions from FERC, with all of these things that are going on, those things all add up to meeting the president's commitment to reduce emissions 50 to 52% by 2030.
That's phenomenal, Janet. And one of the things that kind of comes to mind for me is there's a lot of changes happening at once across a lot of different sectors. And yet there may be a lot of backlash that might really kind of bubble up. And I'm curious how much you all are kind of thinking about and planning for that, level of kind of backlash, both from, the various sectors, but also from maybe those who stand to, lose on some of this.
Right. Well, nobody wants to spend years on rules that don't have an impact, right? I certainly don't. I've spent much of my life working on those sorts of things. And we live in a society where people are allowed to put forward their views. And often they are not in alignment with what any particular administration is thinking is the right thing to do. So of course we're very, very mindful of this. And there can be a lot of rhetoric. You may have heard it out there about whether the federal government is going way beyond its mandate or is ignoring facts and science or is influenced by this or that. And I just want to assure you that the EPA I have worked at has always put science, facts, and the law and being transparent about what we're doing absolutely at the forefront of what we do. And if we do that, then I feel good going into court, because you're right. I don't know that I've worked on a single thing at EPA that hasn't been challenged by somebody, right? It's just kind of the way our system works. And we don't even have Melissa Hoffer anymore in our Office of General Counsel to help us defend these rules. Fortunately, we have a very strong team there who's doing a great job as they weep for her not being there anymore. So I know it will happen, and we'll lose some cases, and hopefully we'll win a lot of cases because we're doing the right thing here. But we'll keep moving forward, and if it turns out that somebody thinks we should have done it a different way, we'll go back and fix it and do it another way and try to bring people in as much as possible. But I'll tell you that even with all the rhetoric and the backlash, industry more and more we hear them saying, yeah, these are the right things to do, and we're doing them ourselves in our own corporate policy, in the way we make decisions, and how can we work on this together? And we always welcome that. Truly, I mean, you can't develop effective regulations if you're not talking with the industry that is going to be regulated, because it just won't work. So all those things come together, and we try to move forward and continue to evolve in those relationships, in improving the transparency that we can use, in improving the way people can get information to us. One last thing I'll say, and I'm sorry I go on too long in these answers, but is that one of the really important things for President Biden is that people who have not had a voice in policymaking traditionally have a voice in policymaking. And that is a powerful constituency to start bringing, not just we think you should do X or Y, but this is the way it is in my community. This is what it looks like. This is what the water in my backyard looks like. This is how many times my basement floods. This is how often my kid can't go to the playground because of too much air pollution. And those are facts. Those are people's lived experience, and they are valid for purposes of the things that we should be taking into account.
That was the perfect segue. We started off today's discussion around kind of this is climate change and is personal. And so being able to hear those stories and voices that is equally as powerful as when we talk about kind of the big picture. And so just along those lines, President Biden has committed to what he calls the most ambitious environmental justice agenda ever undertaken by the federal government. Part of that is the Justice 40 initiative, which aims to steer at least 40% of all federal spending on climate change to disadvantaged communities. So out of curiosity, how is that going? And can you tell us about a few of the projects you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking about that. And I think Melissa mentioned Justice 42. What an amazing way for a president to focus people's attention on the fact that investments in this country have not been fairly distributed. And for EPA, we actually, over the years, have, I don't know what the numbers would be, right? But so many of our programs are focused on areas where communities are overburdened by pollution and have been for many, many years. That for some of our programs, 40%, come on, we're at 80, 90%, right? Our brownfields program, our job training programs, the Superfund program, a lot of those programs are naturally focused on those communities. But if you think about other agencies that maybe haven't had environmental justice so much in their purview, this is really causing them to think about that. So to answer your question, we are doing very well on Justice 40. It is making even those programs that are already naturally focused in that direction much more intentional about it, and very proud of the fact that they're overachieving. And some of our other programs where it can be harder to quantify, it's causing us to think about it. So if you pass a regulation that addresses cement plants nationwide, for example, there's some cement plants everywhere. How do you figure out if the benefits of that rule, how they're benefiting low income and underserved communities? And it's important for us to do that. So we're working on all of those kinds of things. And I know we'll get to some of this in some of your later questions. There's lots of other things besides Justice 40 that EPA is doing around environmental justice and equity.
Are there some projects that you're particularly excited about?
Well, I have to say, so in the job that I'm in now, I get to dip into a lot of the programs, and one of the most fun things I get to do is attend graduation ceremonies at job training programs. And if you've never gotten to go to one, oh my gosh, it's just great. I went to one in Chicago, and it was like the happiest, rowdiest high school, college graduation you could ever want to go to. And I talked to one person, people from all ages, different backgrounds, going through these programs. And I said to one guy, I said, "What are you going to do now that you have all this training?" And he said, "I'm going to start my environmental career." They're being trained for careers in service to their communities with really important skills that are not just important in this moment, but and it's so great that you put me right after Melissa, because I get to just point to so many things she said. Going into the future, our yards are going to be flooding more. Our sensibility about pollution in our neighborhoods is going to be higher and higher and higher. And so having these skills makes these people really valuable members of their community, and they're so proud. So when I think about really joyous things, I think about that. Now, I'll tell you about another one that's not so joyous. You may have heard of Lowndes County, Alabama. Anybody heard of Lowndes County? I know Melissa has. Not too many people have heard of Lowndes County, Alabama. So Lowndes County, Alabama very high majority, people of color, long-time community, with basically no indoor plumbing for many of the people. These are American citizens, tax-paying people who've lived in these communities for years, and they have what are called straight pipes, taking the sewage from their house into their yard or into the nearby creek. And Lowndes County is not the only place in this country where this happens, but it's a really egregious example of it. And the administrator went down and visited Lowndes County. There's a champion down there. Her name is Catherine Flowers. She's amazing. She's a MacArthur. She won one of those MacArthur Genius Award things for her work there. And places like Lowndes County spurred a program where EPA is working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We've identified about a dozen communities like Lowndes County around the country where we're going to make that not be the case anymore. And think how transformative that is for the people in that community. If you Google this, you'll find photos of the administrator standing with families and seeing where the kids play around these straight pipes. It just breaks your heart. And so to be able, as a federal government, to come in and make a difference there is a phenomenal opportunity.
I think you raise an important question that connects specifically to this initiative. So the administration has explicitly considered, is not explicitly rather, considering racial demographics when assessing whether or not a community is disadvantaged or not. And there's been some pushback on that, that in fact may undermine environmental justice issues. And I'm just curious, have these discussions come up and what might the response be around that?
Yeah, these discussions do come up, and I think they're important discussions to have. I think the president has been very clear with his marching orders to the agencies that we are to focus on communities that have been disadvantaged and bear an unfair burden of air, water, and land pollution and risk to climate vulnerabilities. And we are to focus on those communities, and that's what we're doing. And we work with those communities all across the country, whoever lives there. And that's really, really important. One of the first things that Administrator Regan said he wanted to do when he took office was to create within the EPA an Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. So for many people, the idea of, oh, you're making an organizational change within EPA, okay, fine, go ahead, do that. But it is incredibly impactful when you work within a bureaucracy, because bureaucracies operate based on organization. And so what he was saying is, our environmental justice, EPA has been working on environmental justice for decades and decades, right? But it was a small office. It kind of moved around from place to place. It didn't have its own statutory mandate. It had to scrabble for a budget. From the offices like the Air Office and the Water Office that have Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and these very clear mandates and lots of money coming in to fulfill those mandates. What he was saying is, we need to have an office on par with the offices of air, water, and land that is focused on environmental justice and external civil rights. Put those two functions together that had been separated and give them a leader who is going to be a peer of the heads of the air, water, land, et cetera, offices. And that is transformational, and we have gotten that done. And so that is now part of EPA's organizational structure, and it's having a cascading effect because the regional offices around the country, and David Cash is here today, who runs our New England office, they are also setting up offices to focus on environmental justice and civil rights that are on par, on a peer level in the organization to air, water, land. So, this is something that will last organizationally, and it is changing the way people think about and internalize the need for focus on environmental justice, so that we look at it in everything we do. It's exactly what Melissa was saying. So you have the person in Massachusetts who's in charge of buying insulation for the prisons. And that person may not have thought about, that's an environmental justice issue right there, by the way, as well as a climate issue. And that person may not have thought about this. But now the expectation is that that person will think about it too. And that's what is happening in EPA because of this focus on an elevation of environmental justice and just making sure that it's as important as everything else. If I could add one other thing, this gives me such a nice opportunity to talk about the amazing things that this administration is creating that I think will have lasting effect. So many of you may know that the first administrator of the EPA and the third administrator of the EPA was William Ruckelshaus, great American hero, right? Known by many people more for his role in the Watergate situation than at EPA. But he was EPA's first administrator, and then he came back in after an administration of incredible turmoil where at least one person went to prison as a result of it. And he issued something called the Fishbowl Memo, which is notorious at EPA in a good way. And he said EPA should do three things: follow the science, follow the law, and be transparent. And if we do those three things, we will be doing our job for the American people. And you heard me refer to those three things before. Well, Administrator Regan has now added a fourth pillar, which is equity. Seek equity. And that, again, is a transformative and I believe will be a long-lasting legacy of this administration when it comes to making sure that everybody in this country, whatever their color, enjoys public health, quality of life, and a thriving economy.
I really love that point. And I think one of the questions I want to kind of follow up that point with is really, regardless of what happens in 2024, how can we continue to make sure that equity is a part of this conversation, both around, environmental justice and more specifically around climate action?
Yeah, I think we're beyond it not being part of the conversation. I think there are too many people who are feeling it themselves now. Too much has happened in this country for most people to ignore both of these things, equity and what's happening with the climate, for us ever to turn back. And I think the folks who are out there, wherever they are, however they get a platform, who poo-poo climate change as an important issue, who do not support the notion that there should be fairness around environmental, climate, public health issues around this country, are becoming more and more isolated and more not taken seriously. Which isn't to say that there won't continue to be those voices. I'm sure that there will continue to be those voices. But I just think they're less and less relevant as we move forward. And the more flooding there is, the more wildfires there are, sorry to say, the more drought there is, the more food prices go up, the more supply chain issues there are, the more everybody will realize that we have to be thinking about this. Any responsible corporate leader today, if I'm the head of whatever, I'm not going to name a company because that wouldn't be good, but X corporation, right? They're not just thinking about today, they're thinking about the future of their company. They're thinking about their employees, the responsibility they have for their employees and the communities they operate in. They're thinking about, any food service company is thinking about, am I going to have a product 20 years from now? How are we going to make bread and cereal and all of these things in the future? And so it's the responsibility is on them to be thinking about these things too. So I just don't think we're going to go back.
We're sitting here with an audience full of public health practitioners.
I know, I love
it. One of the key things that we really focus on is that climate change is indeed a public health issue. I'm curious, what do you think about that link? And then how would you recommend we do a better job of really communicating that point?
I think that's such an important question. So I came up in the environmental world through the Clean Air Act and doing air quality work, and I think there's no way to avoid the environment and public health link when you work on the air quality side, because that's what it's all about. Well, there's acid rain, which kills forests, and that's critically important too. But really, we focus on the way air pollution affects people's lungs and their health. Climate change is a public health issue. There's no doubt about it. One thing that EPA just did recently was we just put out a report on climate change and children's health, which is really important. And you can sort of internalize, oh yeah, right, children, very important. But where's the research? Where is the cost-benefit analysis? Where are all the things that people look to support regulatory and policy action when you're trying to make a case about the effects of climate change on children's health in the future? We don't have enough of it. So we need more of it. To get to your question about communication, I think that reports like this can be really helpful. I spent a number of years in the nonprofit sector, and I applied for grants. So I've been on the other side of this. And reports like that from EPA were things that I used in order to justify the requests that I was making for funds. So it's a two-way street here. I want to, as they say in some circles, foot stomp Melissa's, I didn't know that phrase until a couple of years ago. I kind of like it. Foot stomp what Melissa said about speaking up. Everybody needs to speak up. And I think increasingly we're seeing that. Boston is a big city. Lots of us live in small communities or smaller communities. They want letters from their readers. They want content to put out. They love to get local people speaking out about issues that matter to them. So there are opportunities there. There are opportunities at conferences like this. There are opportunities wherever you encounter people in your life to make sure you're talking about these things. I think making the connection between climate change, which can be kind of abstract and science-y, to people's lives makes a difference. And if it's difficult to have a conversation, everybody's a scientist on some level. I had to water my tomatoes a lot more last summer. What about you, right? Or I remember hearing about getting an email from a woman in Alaska who said, I just saw a hummingbird outside my kitchen window in Anchorage. We don't have hummingbirds in Alaska. Right? These are personal observations and experiences that can really bring home to people things are quite different now and getting differenter. And I had another really wise point that I've totally forgotten. So perhaps I will remember it in a minute.
Well, I'm just going to close us out. I have a final question. And Melissa, I really do appreciate that you surveyed the audience on this and in thinking about, not feeling hopeless, but rather being able to be optimistic. I'm curious for the many students and trainees that we have in this room, what advice would you give them? If they're interested in pursuing careers in this space, they really are our hope for the next generation, for the future, but also for ourselves to stay hopeful as mentors, as folks who are practicing and doing this work right now. Are there kind of a closing set of thoughts on really being able to pursue and stay in this and be optimistic as we continue the way forward?
I think it's so important to be optimistic. And Melissa, I'm glad you asked that question at the end, because I hope that's the way most people feel. And if you don't, you should talk to somebody. But you have an opportunity, if you are just coming up now and this is something that you're interested in, you have more opportunities than you've ever had before as a way to get engaged and make a difference. There are needs at every aspect of society for people to focus on this. So, for example, if you really love the world of insulation and that's what you want to do, you want to be a a building HVAC person, which has got to be one of the hardest jobs ever, right? Because nobody's ever happy. They're either too hot or too cold. But there's a part of that job now that is a climate job where you can make a difference. I say this when I talk to people about coming to EPA now. You're an accountant. Great, we need you. You are a communications person. We really need you. You are a technology person. We super need you. You're a big data person. Come to EPA. There's a job for you. And all of those jobs have as their mission protecting human health and the environment and dealing with climate change and bringing equity to this country. So, and in the private sector, there are so many opportunities. I spent time at Indiana University. I spent a lot of time with undergrads and master's students at the O'Neill School of Public Policy and the Environment, one of the top ranked master's programs in the country. And those students, most of them do want to work at EPA. I will say that, but a lot of them go into the private sector, and they take all of their knowledge and understanding and perspectives, and they take their hometowns to those jobs in the private sector as well, and that is really, really, really exciting. Another thing, just as a personal note, somebody asked me at a program a while back what I did to stay motivated and optimistic, and I said only half in jest. I eat one Oreo every night, so I say that because you have to take care of yourself too, and pay attention to, don't let yourself get overwhelmed, either with grief, despair, anger, or just by working so hard that you can't see straight and can't be there for your family and for yourself. So have that Oreo every day. This is not an advertisement for Oreos. Whatever cookie floats your boat, or a carrot or something. So
Thank you so much.